The essence is that positive psychology focuses on what works. That's it. If there is one thing you remember from this presentation, remember this: focusing on what works. What does this mean? So for example, in terms of research, most of the research done in psychology until recently has been on depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and the bad boss. Positive psychology says, let's also do research on happiness, well-being, job satisfaction, and success. Moreover, if I go to a therapist, to a psychologist today, what's the first question that she will ask me? The first question is, what's wrong? Why are you here? Or if my wife and I go to a couples counselor, the first question that he will ask us is, what's not going well in your relationship? What brought you to me? Or if I invite a consultant to my company, the first question that she's likely to ask is, what's not going well? What are the weaknesses? What do we need to work on and fix? These are good questions. They're important questions. But what positive psychologists say is that we also need to ask the other questions. So for example, if I go to a therapist, a question needs to be, what's going well in your life? Let's start with that and then deal with the difficulties. If we go to a couples counselor, the first question of a positive psychologist would be, what is going well in your relationship? If I bring in a positive psychologist as a consultant, the first question is, what are your strengths as a leader? What are the strengths of your organization? What is going well? Tell me about success stories that we can build on. In the words of Marty Seligman, who's considered the founder of positive psychology, the aim of positive psychology is to catalyze a change in psychology from a preoccupation only with repairing the worst things in life to also building the best qualities in life. With an emphasis on also. Positive psychology does not say, let's ignore depression or anxiety or bad mood in the organization. What positive psychology says is, let's also not ignore when things are going well. Because as we'll see very soon, focusing on what works, works. Now, assuming, because I will give you a lot of research on this, but assuming that indeed focusing on what works, works. How do I get people, how do I get myself, how do I get my child, how do I get my partner, how do I get my employees to focus on what works? And the answer to this question lies in the questions that we ask. Let me illustrate this through a case study. So this is the case of at-risk population, poor areas, where there's been a lot of research done, mostly started in the 1940s. 1947, 48, money started to pour in, resources. Top psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers began to invest time, effort, resources into helping children in poor areas, at-risk population. The research question that guided most of these people was, why do these individuals fail? Why do so many individuals from these areas drop out of school early? Why do so many end up doing drugs? Why is crime so high? Why are so many girls becoming pregnant at a young age? These are all important questions. They are good questions, but evidently not enough. After between 30 and 40 years of these programs, the UN, UNESCO, conducted a study, a meta-analysis looking at all the interventions that came out of this question, why do these individuals fail? And what they found was that over between 30 and 40 years, very little actual change came about. Good intentions, had all the resources, but these people, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, even though they were smart, even though they wanted to help, even though they had the resources to help, didn't help this population. All this changed in the 1980s. It changed with the founders of the field of positive psychology, with a change in question. And the question that they began to ask them was, what makes some individuals succeed despite unfavorable circumstances? You see, because not all children failed. There were some who succeeded, and succeeded big time. They were not the majority, they were a small minority, but they were there. And when psychologists started to learn from what works, to focus on these children, that made all the difference. Suddenly programs that hadn't been working for 30 to 40 years were working. I'll give you two examples. An 8-week program by Richie Davidson and John Kabat-Zinn, psychologist and a neuroscientist, improved levels of compassion, reduced levels of anxiety, improved success in this population with an 8-week program. Karen Rivich teaches at University of Pennsylvania, introduced a 2-week program that reduced the likelihood of depression in this population by more than 50%. Look at the difference that a question made. For decades, with good intentions, the resources, the smarts, they didn't help the population they so wanted to help. And suddenly the question changes and the reality changes. Because they started to learn from what works. Because they started to focus on the successful children. The minority, but they were there. And here is what they learned. What they learned about these successful children, what distinguished them from the rest, was that these children were resilient. They were able to bounce back from failure. Now, today we all talk about resilience. But back in the 1980s, there were two women, two researchers, Mustin and Reed, who did research in Hawaii. No one heard about them. They talked about the importance of resilience. Today we know how important it is because we started to learn from those children that make it despite the unfavorable circumstances. And initially when they looked at these children, they said to themselves, wow, these are super kids. Some genetic anomaly, something out of the ordinary. But when they looked at these kids closer, when they studied them, when they really focused on what works, they realized these were not extraordinary kids. These are ordinary kids with ordinary characteristics that lead to extraordinary results. What are some of these ordinary characteristics? And think about them in the context of your life. Think about them in the context of your children, because these apply as much to a child being born and raised in Harlem or inner city Chicago or the slums of Mumbai as they do to a wealthy person, to a Fortune 500 CEO. They apply to all of us because we all need resilience today when the world is changing so fast, when there are new challenges by the nanosecond. So what are some of these characteristics that they identified? Well, first of all, these children set future goals. They were future-oriented. They didn't ignore the present, but at the same time, they didn't ignore what they wanted to accomplish, the things that were meaningful to them, that gave them a sense of purpose. These children were optimistic, not detached optimism, but grounded optimism, which we'll talk about later. These children had role models, someone that they looked up to, whether it was mom or dad, their teacher, or a historical figure, but someone about whom they said, I want to be like him, I want to be like her. Someone they looked up to. And finally, these children focused on their strength. They did not ignore their weaknesses. At the same time, they did not ignore what they were good at. Now here's the thing. When psychologists looked at these characteristics, they said, wait a minute, these things can be taught, these things can be learned, which is exactly what they started to do with the other children. We have goal-setting theory going back 50 years ago. It's Locke, Latham, Deci, Ryan, Lubomirsky, Sheldon, many researchers. You do it in your organizations. We know how to set goals, and this is what psychologists started to do with the other children who weren't doing it naturally. We know how to increase levels of optimism. Marty Seligman has a book called The Optimistic Child about raising optimism for children. He has another book called Learned Optimism, which is about raising optimism in ourselves. This is, by the way, what Karen Rivich did in her 2-week program. She taught optimism, decreasing the likelihood of depression by over 50% in that population. We know how to help people identify their role models. First of all, be a role model. Second, get them to read about role models. You know what the best self-help books are? The best self-help books are not the ones who give you the 5 easy steps to happiness or the 3 things you need to do to be a great leader. The best self-help books are good, solid biographies. Books that show you the real deal, the ups and the downs, the difficulties and the triumphs. So these children started to read biographies and learn from those, identify role models. And these children started to focus on their strength. How do you focus on their strength? 2 questions. First set of questions, what are you good at? What are your strengths? Second set of questions, what gives you strength? What energizes you? What are you passionate about? And when students identified and pursued these 2 sets of questions, the things that they were good at and the things that gave them strength, that made all the difference. Look at the difference that a question makes. For decades, no one could help them. And suddenly, a new question changes the reality. Why? Because questions create reality by defining reality.